All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a really good weekend. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you again in person, but I got an interview kind of scheduled at the last minute, so I'm actually headed to Kentucky later today. So I'll be in Kentucky doing my interview on Tuesday while you're actually in class. So I wanted to go ahead and record this so that you would have a little bit of a review session before the exam and to kind of explain a little bit more about the exam so that you can kind of be more prepared. So before I do that, just a quick announcement. If you haven't done the career assignment yet, please do that. I will accept it late. You will lose points, obviously, for it being a late submission, but I will take it. So any points you can get is better than a 0. So please do that. So also, if you are online and you're not going to be able to make it to campus to take the exam, and you have not already gotten with me about a proctor, please let me know if you've scheduled a proctor or set that up somewhere so that I can send you the form, because you will need a password to access the exam on Thursday. So please check your email if you haven't already done so, and there should be an email in there for me about that. Excuse me. So also, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the exam in general. So the exam is going to be, I think it's 54 questions. I've already made it, so it's done. And they're going to be a combination of multiple choice questions, fill in the blank, true, false, matching, and a few short answer. So pretty much every type of question style that you get is going to be on there. You'll have an hour and 20 minutes to take it, so your standard class period time. And most of the questions are fairly easy. They shouldn't take you too long, and even the short answer questions are very, very quick. You don't need to write an essay or anything like that. So they really shouldn't take you that long to do. So I've also created a forum on Blackboard in the discussion board for Exam 1 questions. Since I am not able to be there with you live today, if you have any questions about the material or the exam or anything like that, please feel free to post those there. I will be checking that very frequently as I travel, so that I can answer any questions that you may have about that before the exam. And again, like I mentioned, feel free to answer each other's questions. If you see a question on there someone asked and you've been studying hard and you already know the answer, feel free to go ahead and answer that for them as well. And other students probably have the same question, so don't be shy about putting a question up in the discussion board. And I've found in my previous online classes I've taken, it actually helps people study when a lot of students get involved and ask questions on the discussion board. So with that being said, what I'm going to do today is just kind of go through each of the PowerPoints that we've covered just very quickly, very briefly, and just kind of point out some things that I may have pointed out in the lectures, but more specifically just kind of point out some of the information that I feel is really important to kind of give you an idea of what I might pull to kind of be on the exam, just so you have kind of a better idea of what to study. Will not be pulling anything from the book that is not in the lecture notes. So all of the test material will be coming from what's in your lecture notes. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first lecture. Okay. So our first lecture was the Animals in Society lecture that just kind of gave an introduction. So the first thing that we kind of talked about was what is animal science, obviously, because that's what the class is about. So I would expect you to have some idea of this definition. You may not need to know it exactly word for word, but kind of you can put it in your own words, but make sure that you really understand the definition of animal science. Because that would definitely be something that I would expect you to know, being that that's what the course is about. I would expect you to know, kind of why study animal science. We talked about a bunch of different things: increasing world population, countries becoming more developed, farmland, production needing to be more efficient, things like that, because that's really what drives the study of animal science. So that's really important. So I would definitely know that. So for the exam, I'm not going to expect you to know too many numbers, but there are some that I think are kind of important that kind of stand out that I will kind of expect you to know. So for example, on this slide, One thing that I may kind of put on the exam is something like how or what would the total population be expected to reach by 2050, or what is the world population currently. Those numbers, just because that increasing population is what's driving a lot of research in animal science, and so those numbers are kind of important. So I would know, maybe the 10 billion or 7.5 billion for the exam. And so again, with this slide, world hunger, I'm not going to ask you, any of these numbers, how many calories they're eating or anything like that. For the exam, I'm mostly going to go, kind of a little bit more general concepts, and then ask you about some kind of specific terms and things like that, but not the nitty gritty, all of these numbers and things like that. So there's been growth in cities, which we talked about. I'm not going to ask you, each number for each city, so you don't have to worry about that. Just know that the U.S. is growing, and that population's increasing. Know a little bit about development, and that, agricultural lands are being replaced by residential subdivisions, but nothing too specific on that. Know, kind of general things about this slide. Maybe, know a little bit about what smart growth is. And so then we talked about greenfield and brownfield development. And so because those are two different types of development, and they both have differences, I will expect you to know the differences between those two, and maybe kind of an advantage of or disadvantage of either one. So definitely be familiar with that. And then we kind of talked about hunger. So might want to know some issues associated with hunger. I'm not going to ask you these numbers up here, because I think that's getting a little bit too detailed for what I want you to learn from this class. So just some goals. Again, this is kind of more numbers. I'm not going to ask you specifics there. Yes, we talked about hunger caused by poverty and a cause of poverty. That was a big thing. Know a little bit about food security, and kind of what that is. That would be good to study. So obviously agriculture is really important. So know that we've made progress in the ability of farmers to feed a growing population, and that the Green Revolution has had a dramatic effect on people's lives in the developing world. So I would expect you to know what the Green Revolution is, and basically just that it's using improved genetics for agriculture. Of course, the more you know about it, the better, but at least know what it is and what it's done, and be familiar with that. I'm not going to ask you about corn yield in every year, because I don't expect you to know all of those numbers. Yeah, I'm not going to expect you to know that. But kind of generally what I would expect you to know and kind of pick out from these slides is that there have been marked increases in yields for wheat, rice, and other cereals. So I'm not going to ask you the exact numbers or the percentage increases or anything like that, but just know that the yields are increasing for those cereal grains. So this is kind of just more about the Green Revolution, who started the Green Revolution. That might be important to know. You don't need to know that acronym or anything like that. Just basically, what was the Green Revolution, who started it, what did it do? So corn, we talked a good amount about corn. I would kind of expect you to know that it's a cereal grain, and know that it is used in lots of different livestock feed, and especially for pigs, poultry, and feedlot cattle. And corn silage can be used for cattle. So just a couple things that kind of stand out as major concepts that I want you to get about corn. That would be it. I'm not going to ask you, how much was produced in 2015. So a little bit about animal agriculture in the developing world. Know that livestock makes a significant contribution to the poor, that they provide a route out of the poverty trap, that they can provide a source of cash and provide high quality nutrition. So be familiar with this slide and kind of know about animal agriculture in the developing world and how livestock can help improve that. And this is just kind of continued from that previous slide. So I would be familiar with this slide as well. So that's all for the chapter 1 notes. So now we're going to move to chapter 2. So I need to move this. Okay. So chapter 2, we talked about the origin and development of agriculture. And those are just the objectives. So we talked about the hunter-gatherer stage and what that was. And then in the Neolithic Revolution is when that shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to agriculture and permanent settlements kind of happened. So I would expect you to know kind of what was going on in the hunter-gatherer stage, and then what was the name of the revolution that caused them to, which was the time period when they started settling down into permanent settlements. I would like you to know, when that happened, and kind of how that happened, and what happened as a result of that. So pretty much just what's covered in the next slides. So permanent settlements, why did those come about? And then kind of what happened in society due to the permanent settlements. So the need to protect land, establishment of military, establishment of taxation, specialized jobs, society became more hierarchical. So things like that, be familiar with this slide because that was really important, and permanent settlements really set the scene for a lot of things that progressed in society. So I really expect you to be familiar with this slide. As far as animal and plant domestication, be familiar with this slide as well. I expect you to know the area where domestication in Neolithic times started happening, that it was near the rivers Tigris, Euphrates, and the Nile, and I would expect you to be familiar with the term Fertile Crescent. So these are just all the domesticated plants and animals. I'm not going to ask you to list every single one of them. I might ask you what were the other 2 cradles of civilization, but I'm not going to ask you to list all of these things under there. As far as plant domestication and even animal domestication, I'm not going to necessarily ask you dates like that, dogs were 15,000 years ago or anything like that. But what I would expect you to know is that cereals were the first plants that were domesticated, and maybe know what cereals are. So wheat, rice, corn, barley, and then kind of just be familiar with pulses and kind of which plants fall in that category, but mainly know that cereals were the first domesticated plants, but I'm not going to ask you dates or anything like that. And so these were just some other plants that were domesticated. You can be familiar with those. It's kind of a lot of information on this slide. So again, I'm probably not going to ask you, where were potatoes domesticated, because that's kind of a lot of detail to remember. So know which ones were domesticated first and which types kind of plants fall in that category. So cereals are really, really important because they are used a lot in livestock feed, especially corn. So I would expect you to know a little bit about cereal domestication. Why were seeds chosen? So amount of seed and ready recovery. So those are really important to know why those seeds were chosen and why those plants were domesticated first as opposed to some other plants. So be familiar with that. Wheat domestication, you might want to know a little bit about kind of how that happened. I'm not going to ask you to list, the most cultivated wheats because, again, I think that's kind of a lot. But so know kind of generally how wheat was domesticated. And then barley, I'm not going to ask you how long ago it was domesticated. I might ask you does it have 2 road spikes or 6 road or 16 road barley? So know that there's a 2 road and a 6 road variety, and that it's used to make bread and beer, just kind of general with barley. Corn, because it is one of the major ingredients used in livestock feed. Be familiar with corn, and that it's one of the major cereals that's used today, and that it was domesticated in Central America. I'm not going to ask you, how many years ago, because I don't want to get too into the numbers unless they're numbers that I think are really important. So this slide is pretty important. If the human genome changed as the human diet changed to include large amounts of high starch, that's very interesting, and I think that that's a really good point in this lecture. And then that saliva contains the enzyme amylase, which initiates the digestion of starch. I could ask you what that enzyme name is, because that's a really important enzyme, and especially on this slide, that's really important to know. And also that more copies of the genes are found in populations that consume high amounts of starch. So just familiarize yourself with this slide. So for the domestication of the animals, again, I'm not going to ask you dates, so I just say that a lot, just make sure that you know. But I may ask you, what was the first domesticated animal, and which animal was it domesticated from? So something kind of simple like that you would need to know. So dogs came from the gray wolf, cats came from the Near Eastern wildcat. And another thing that I would expect you to know is, why were these animals domesticated? What were dogs helpful for? How did that domestication kind of come about? Especially cats, because there was a huge need for cats to reduce the loss of stored grain from rodents. And so know that, and what the reason was for these animals to be domesticated, I think is more important than the actual dates of when it happened. And so then, of course, other, sheep, goats, cattle were also domesticated. So you don't need to know exactly when those happened, but maybe kind of be familiar with the order in which they happened. So then, same like dogs and cats, why were sheep, goats, and cattle domesticated? What were some of the benefits from domesticating those animals? So that would be all of the ones listed on this slide. Livestock production today, you can be familiar with this slide and a little bit about how it may differ from back when agriculture was kind of getting started. So kind of review that. So pigs were domesticated in China and in the Fertile Crescent, and then chickens in China also. So know that pigs and chickens are good scavengers and provide an excellent source of meat. So that's kind of the main point there. And then horses, you need to know what they were used for, why they were domesticated. So they were selected for useful attributes, and then they were used for food, hunting, and transportation. So again, not so much where or when, but why, I think is the big one on that. And then just be familiar with some other domesticated mammals. Feral animals is a term that we've talked about quite a bit in the different lectures. So I would expect you to be able to define a feral animal, and what they can do, that they can breed in the wild. I would expect you to know how they can affect the ecosystems that they're in. So these 3 things down here on this slide. And then we also talked about quite a few examples of feral animals. So it might be good to kind of have at least 1 or 2 examples of a feral animal in your back pocket for the exam. Since we did cover quite a bit, definitely be familiar with what they are and what animals are kind of classified as feral. And so that's it for chapter 2. So now we're going to move on to chapter 3. So chapter 3 was just a global overview of the livestock industry. So importance of global animal production, obviously you need to know that people depend on animal production and processing for their livelihood, etc. You might want to know that livestock production accounts for 37% of world agriculture. compared to 63 is crop production. So just know that crops kind of contribute more than livestock production does. I would expect you to know that the U.S. has higher meat consumption than other countries. That's really important. And increased consumption of animal products can improve pregnancy outcomes and growth and cognition in infants and children. You should know that. So this slide, you can be familiar with the fact that livestock do not compete with people as much as we thought for grains, and that the percentage of grains used by livestock will go down as production systems become more efficient. So I would expect you to know the top 3 animal producing countries. So the US, the People's Republic of China, and Brazil. So definitely know those 3. It's good to know where most of the animals are being produced in the world. So that's something that you need to be familiar with. And this is just that chart that shows you. I'm not going to ask you numbers, just what are the top 3. So I may ask you a little bit about why there's been an increase in animal agriculture. So you would need to kind of go over this slide. You can know that animal products provide a lot of nutrients and a lot of vitamins and things like that. I'm not going to ask you percentages. And you can know that the proportion of protein and other nutrients coming from animal products is lower in developing countries. So in general, know in the different types of productions whether there's been an increase in that type of production or a decrease. Not numbers or percentage increases, but just know whether it's going up or down. So there has been a major increase in global production of meat from cattle and milk, and increases in all production systems. So I might ask you, how much do beef, pork, and poultry represent of the meat produced or consumed globally? That would be 1/3. And then know that beef production is growing and that there's been a large increase in China. So I definitely would expect you to know the top players for each type of production. And really what I would mainly like you to focus on is the number 1 player. So for beef production, that would be the United States. For milk production, that would be India, and so forth. Just be familiar with the country that produces the most of that type of livestock. So, and with milk production, make sure that you're careful with that one, because the U.S. is the number 1 producer of milk from cattle, but India is the number 1 milk producer overall. So make sure that you understand that difference. And if you need to know what's the top milk producing country, your answer would be India. So know that there have been increases in pork production and all production systems. And then, like we talked about earlier, pigs were scavengers in villages. Maybe know a little bit about the current trend in pork production, that it's going towards large, highly efficient pig producing operations, and just overall that there's been an increase in pork production. Know that China is the top country that produces the most pork. So there's been static production in Europe. However, in most of the other countries, pork production is increasing. So just know that overall trend. And I may ask you why pig and poultry production is often near densely populated areas, near cities. And that would be, these 2 points right here. So you might want to know that. So poultry and egg production is also increasing. So be familiar with the fact that it's increasing, why it's increasing, that it's due to consumer preference and lower prices. I expect you to know the United States is number 1 in chicken production. Know that egg production is growing, and that Asian countries have had high rates of egg production increases. And again, you don't need to know the numbers or percentage increases. Okay. Chapter 4. Okay, so Chapter 4, we talked about careers in animal science. And probably out of all of the lectures that we covered, I probably asked fewer questions on this PowerPoint, just because it's not so much content as more for your benefit and to help you with a future job. It's a little bit less scientific content, if you will. So there are some questions that I'm going to ask you from this lecture, but if you kind of want to divide your time, I would say this is probably the one that you don't need to focus on quite as much, because it's not quite as heavy into the animal science content. So just know a little bit about what a background in animal science would give you, the kinds of things that you would be familiar with, the career areas that you could go into with a degree in animal science, some skills. A lot of these are pretty straightforward, common sense type things. So I would expect you to know off the top of your head a few areas of employment that people with a degree in animal science could go into. I'm not going to ask you to list all of these, but be familiar with at least 3 or 4 different areas that someone with a degree could go into. You might want to know, just a little bit about the different types of jobs that you could have, what the responsibilities might be. So in animal breeding and health, in this slide, for example, I will point out anything in my lectures that I have bolded or underlined. A lot of times they're both bolded and underlined. You can pretty much guarantee that term is going to show up in your exam. So just a big hint there. So I would expect you to know what a transgenic animal is, because that's kind of an important topic that you might come across in later animal science classes if you do continue on in animal science. So be familiar with that term and what that is. Know a little bit maybe about what happens in animal health. There's development of new drugs. You could know, a little bit about opportunities for animal scientists there in that category, that you could also work in business and finance. Kind of different jobs you have in the dairy industry, education, maybe know a little bit about what you could do as far as in the government for animal science, and then really just a little bit about just the kind of careers you can have, basically. I'm not going to get too detailed with this section. So I might ask you, when seeking a career, what are some things that you should do? And then I may ask you things about building a resume. So, how do you go about putting together a resume, or what's important? Do you have to tailor a resume to each job, or just one general kind of work? Those types of questions that I might ask you. I may ask you advantages of internships, preparing the application. This slide, definitely be familiar with for the exam. There may be 1 or 2 questions from this slide. Just things that I think you need to know about a resume, cover letter, or CV, because those are really important when you're looking for jobs. And then again, preparing for interview and the interviews, I would say all of that is pretty straightforward. So you can kind of briefly go over that, but I'm not going to ask super detailed questions from this lecture. Maybe what are some interview don'ts versus interview do's kind of thing. And then that's all for that one. So chapter 5 was horses, and there was quite a bit of content in this lecture and the next lecture. So there will be a good amount of questions from the chapter 5 lecture and the chapter 6 lecture. So make sure that you are comfortable with those. I may ask you what the species name of horses is, so that'd be Equus caballus. there's been a close relationship. I would expect you to know the difference between what distinguishes a pony versus a horse, so that ponies are below 14.2 hands in height, because I think if you're going to know anything about horses, that's pretty important. You might want to just be familiar with the exceptions to that rule, but know that 14.2 number. I would expect you to be familiar with what a hand is and what a hand actually measures. So know that a hand is 4 inches, just because I think that's really important when you're talking about measuring a horse. And then I would also expect you to be familiar with where you measure horse height. So, you don't measure it back here. You don't measure it at the top of the head. You measure it from the point of the withers down. So that's pretty important to know. So be familiar with that. I'm not going to ask you the different breed height differences, because that's kind of a lot of numbers to know. I'm not going to ask you, what's the order that the horse is in, because I think genus and species are a little bit more important. But I would expect you to know that horses are odd-toed ungulates. So be familiar with that and what that means. And then again, we have a bolded underlined term there. I would expect you to know what this means, and that means any hoofed mammal. And then maybe be able to list a few that are odd-toed and a few that are even-toed. So be familiar with that. I'm not going to ask you necessarily what family they're in, but I may ask you what are some other animals that are in the same family as horses. So that would be any from this list right here. And then as far as evolution of the horse, pretty much just know that it started off with one animal that eventually just had an increase in size, and that's how we got to the modern day horse. You don't need to know, years or the exact size of that animal or anything like that. Just know that there was a gradual increase in size over time. And so this slide, again, just kind of shows you that. But I'm not going to expect you to know, all of the names of these ancestors of the horse. Just know that they got larger and larger over time. So know that from this slide, I would say know that evolution wasn't linear and that there were many branches to the evolution of the horse. And then that all branches except Equus, which is the branch of the modern horse, are actually extinct. So again, kind of like we talked about in the domestication PowerPoint, why were horses domesticated? What were they used for? Know that they allowed for more success in hunting and that they revolutionized warfare and why they revolutionized warfare. So definitely be familiar with this slide and really the reasons behind domestication of the horse. Okay. You can know a little bit about the history of the horse and kind of when things happened. But again, I'm not going to ask you what were horses being used for in 1540. So just kind of be familiar with it, but not to that level of detail. I know that I showed you this slide. I'm not going to ask you to label any of these or anything like that. What I would expect you to be familiar with are a few points that we've talked about for other things. So like the withers, because that's what you use to measure height, I would expect you to know that. And then other areas for body condition score that you look at, like the stifle and the hindquarter and things like that. I would kind of expect you to just be familiar with those. If we mention a body part later on in the lecture or previously in the lecture, kind of know what those are, but I'm not going to ask you to label. So conformation, I think, is pretty important, which is why I added it in. So know what conformation evaluates. So it's bone structure, musculature, and body proportions in relation to each other. Know that kind of, definition of conformation. Know that problems can limit a horse's ability to perform tasks. And as far as the aspects of conformation, I would expect you to know a couple of the different aspects. So like balance and then way of going and structural correctness and things like that. Know that balance is the most critical aspect of conformation and that you want to look at that first. Know what balance is and what it's determined by. Know that it's the equal distribution of muscling and weight, what you see on that slide. So be very familiar with this slide and know that when you're talking about conformation, balance is the most important aspect there. And so then this slide just kind of further talked about balance. Know that the ideal angle for the shoulder and hips is a 45-degree angle, because that's kind of really helpful to kind of remember when you're looking at a horse. So I might very well ask you, what is the angle that the shoulder and hips need to be at for ideal balance? Know a little bit about structural correctness, second important aspect. So know that it is an aspect of conformation and kind of what that looks at. I'm not going to necessarily ask you about all of these different issues. Just have a good idea of what normal looks like. But yeah, I'm not going to ask you to know that that's cowhocked or bow-legged or anything, but know the angles that are ideal and kind of what that looks like. Just know about other aspects of conformation, way of going, muscling, breed, and sex character, that those are important. And then muscling, you would kind of look at the chest, forearm, loin, stifle, and gaskin. So maybe be slightly familiar with where those are on the horse. As far as reproduction, I would expect you to know that horses are long day breeders and what that means. So that means that they breed in the spring, and that they're when the days are getting longer, that's when they're going to start breeding. Also, I am going to expect you to know the length of gestation for not only horses, but dogs, cats, and some of the animals mentioned in the companion animal lecture as well. So know that horse gestation is 336 days, so that if they're bred in the spring, foals will be born in the spring because it is almost a year. Seasonally polyestrous, obviously you're probably catching on by now. I think that's an important term that you should know. Know what that means and how that pertains to horses. So their natural breeding season in the Northern Hemisphere would be spring and summer. But definitely know that seasonally polyestrous means multiple estrus cycles during only part of the year. I'm also going to expect you to be familiar with the terminology for the different species. So foaling, foal, weanling, yearling, filly, colt, mare, stallion, horse, and gelding. I would expect you to know what those terms are. They're very easy vocabulary. If you're going to be in animal science or even in agriculture, it's just good to have some official terms that you can use so that people really know what you're talking about. And you're not just saying, oh, it's a baby horse. You can actually use the proper terminology. So I think that's important. And those two slides would be some easy points for you to get on the test just by knowing those different specific terms for that species. So you might want to know a little bit about breeding challenges, that the birth date is set for January 1, and that's the reason that breeders want foals born as early as possible. And so that's a reason why breeders may attempt to breed horses outside of the normal breeding season. I may ask you about, why they do that. A little bit about stress. The main thing that I would want you to take away from this slide is, what can cause stress. So transportation, treadmill exercise, things like that. And I would really expect you to know that nutritional requirements can be changed as a result of stress. Because that's really important to know if you have an animal that has been stressed out a lot or is going to be stressed out. You need to know how to feed it properly. So definitely know that from this slide. So as far as horse genetics, they have 64 chromosomes. Something that I think is kind of important and that you should know as well if you're going into animal science is that the mare not only provides half the chromosomes of the offspring, but also mitochondrial DNA. And the reason that I think that's important is because this is not just specific to horses. In most species, mitochondrial DNA is provided for them by the mother. So that's kind of an important thing that I would like you to know. As far as equine digestion, I would really like you to know how they are classified. So I would like you to know that they're non-ruminants, which is the same thing as monogastric. So they have a simple stomach. And then I would like you to know that they're herbivores, which means that they eat a diet consisting of plants. And then also that they're hindgut fermenters. Be familiar with the term volatile fatty acids, know what VFAs stands for, and what they are, and kind of how they're produced, and maybe where they're produced in the horse. So really, really review this slide and be familiar with it. And so then more about nutrition. Obviously, meeting nutritional requirements is essential. And then pretty much all animals require energy, protein, vitamin, minerals, and water. Maybe be familiar with some good grasses that can be used for pasture. And then what some concentrated feeds are, so cereals, oat, corn, or wheat. Definitely know about body condition score. Know, pretty much just know this whole slide in general. I would really like for you to mainly know that it's a useful management tool for determining the nutritional needs of livestock. So it's really, really good to see where your animals are, if they're too heavy or too light. But I think body condition score is a really useful tool, not only in horses, but for other livestock species as well. So definitely study this slide. I'm not going to show you pictures and ask you to give me a number because some of them, like those two, I think are a little too hard to distinguish between. So know that 1 means really, really skinny and 9 means obese. Housing, you can know a little bit about that. Just maybe know that the quarter horse is the most popular breed and that a lot of horses are registered. You can know a little bit about the quarter horse, kind of what it's used for mainly. Same with the thoroughbred, what are they mainly used for? And the standard bred, Appaloosa and Arabian, just kind of general things about those. What are they used for? Not going to get too specific on the different breeds. And then these are just some other breeds. Be familiar with the gaits. I may or may not ask you about what's a 4-beat gait in horses, name a 2-beat gait in horses. So just be familiar with those. Again, what horses are used for, which kind of also plays into why they were domesticated. Know that there is some drug abuse in horse racing and that can be an issue. Maybe know that horses can be used for endurance rides or disabled people and crowd control. And then I would like you to know a little bit about the mule in the sense that another term that I think is important comes up on this slide. So hybrid vigor, which is the improvement in qualities that arises from crossbreeding genetically different plants or animals. I would expect you to be familiar with that term, be able to give me a definition of what that is, and know that mules are a really good example of an animal that displays hybrid vigor because they exhibit hardiness, they can resist the sun, heat, and disease. So definitely be familiar with that. All right, and now we are on to the last lecture. Okay, so be familiar with the term companion animal, what it means. Know that all animals are not considered companion animals. There's a specific definition. Cats make good companions. I'm not going to ask you percentages of how many are spayed or neutered. Just know that it's a good amount. Some more nomenclature and definitions for both the dog and cat. I would expect you to know these terms and what they mean and what they refer to, that a dam is a mother of a litter, sire is father, and that's not just for cats, that's for actually quite a few species in general. Queen is an adult female, things like that. Be familiar with those terms. Know that the ancestor is thought to be the Near East African cat, that they were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, which we had talked about previously. And then that cats were domesticated to reduce the problem of mice and rats infesting stored grain. That's a big thing I'd like you to know. We talked a little bit about feral animals and feral cats. So maybe know that they can threaten other wildlife populations. Cats can be used for therapy. Again, like the horse, know that cats are seasonally polyestrous and what that term means. Also know that they're induced or reflex ovulators, which means that they will ovulate only after mating. That's an important term, and I remember I learned a lot about that in my intro class, actually. So definitely know what induced or reflex ovulators means. Know that their length of gestation is about 60 days. Again, the horse is 336, so I might ask you to know those numbers of, the horse, cat, dog, maybe rats and mice, just kind of those main animals that we've discussed. Be familiar with their length of gestation. And then kittens are born in an immature state, which is termed altricial, which means they have limited capacity to see and move around. Altricial is another good term that you might want to be familiar with, because that you may see that term again. So know what that means. Know that cats can be either short-haired or long-haired, and maybe that short hair is dominant, long hair is recessive. So these are some of the abnormalities. I may ask you about the Manx, because we talked a little bit about heterozygous versus homozygous. So heterozygous means they have one copy, which means they have no tail, and homozygous is lethal. So maybe just kind of generally be familiar with some abnormalities. As far as cat nutrition, I would expect you to know that they are carnivores. They're also monogastrics, which I actually do not have on the slide, but know that they're not ruminants. They're not like cows. They're similar to dogs and horses and humans. They have one stomach, one simple stomach. So monogastrics, they're carnivores, so they can live on meat only. That's what really needs to be in their diet. And taurine is an essential amino acid for cats. I know I made a point about this when I went over this lecture, but I will expect you to know what taurine is and which species it is absolutely needed for. And that's huge, because that's the main reason why you can't feed dog food to cats. So definitely know about taurine. Maybe know what causes obesity in cats. I'm not going to ask you about all the registered breeds. As far as dogs, again, I'm not going to ask you percentages or numbers there. Know that there's a good amount of dogs that are abandoned and that can breed, and that a lot of dogs are killed in the U.S., which is a big problem. They make excellent companions. Also, here's that terminology again that I would expect you to be familiar with. Know all of these terms. Again, there's dam and sire. That's come up twice, so you can probably bank on that being on the exam, so that you know what the mother and father of a litter, or mother and father, are called in animal science. And just be familiar with all of those terms. So again, know that dogs were domesticated from the gray wolf. And unlike horses, know the interbreeding of all members of the Canis genus can actually produce fertile hybrids. So, when the horse and donkey breed and you get a mule, mules are more often than not infertile. So that's one difference between the horse kind of members of that genus and family, and the dog. So the dogs actually can all interbreed with wolves and jackals and coyotes and produce fertile hybrids. We talked about that they're domesticated from gray wolves. It's possible there were multiple domestication events. Know a little bit about how domestication occurred, that wolf packs probably lived close to groups of hunter-gatherers, and then that they would have then been selected for reduced aggressiveness and tameness. Maybe know a little bit about working dogs and different things that dogs can do. Therapy dogs are different from service dogs. They're not the same. So as far as dog genetics, there's a large variation in size, coat, and behavior, and breed parentage can be identified in dogs by DNA. There are a lot of different breeds. Dogs can only be registered if both parents are registered. And then we talked about the AKC and the AKC breed groups. Again, I'm probably not going to ask you how many, breeds does it recognize, things like that. I kind of want to focus more on gestation length of the dog and things like that, kind of more of the sciencey things that would help you to know. So speaking of reproduction, dogs are monoestrus, which means that one estrus is followed by a period of anestrus if they're not pregnant for about 6 months. And their gestation is 52 to 58 days, and they typically have about 6 puppies per litter. So their gestation is actually a little bit less than the cat. So do know those numbers. So we've got the horse, 336, cat is 60, and then dogs are 52 to 58. So definitely be familiar with the lengths of gestation. And then we talked a little bit about the first clone dog. For nutrition, I would expect you to know that dogs are largely carnivorous, but that they can thrive on food other than meat. They do not need to have just a diet based exclusively on meat, kind of like cats. And so dogs can also be considered omnivores. So know that they're not necessarily one or the other, that they can be classified as carnivores and omnivores because they're not just strict meat eaters. They're monogastric, same as the cat and the horse, in humans, and they require the same nutrients that other animals require. So make sure that you pay attention to how much you're giving your dog. Just know not to feed them in excess. Maybe know a little bit about the effects of obesity and problems that can cause. We talked a little bit about ferrets, but I'm probably not going to ask you too much about ferrets. We spent a little bit more time on rodents, so you might want to focus a little bit more on rodents. Where are they kept? What kind of animals fall under that category? They have 2 pigments in their fur. Feeds are specifically formulated for different species. I think it's important to note that the CDC recommends that people with weakened immune systems and pregnant women don't bring any rodent into their home because they do carry diseases. So that's really important to know. Rats and mice are mainly used as research animals, which is why I'll kind of focus a little bit more on them as opposed to like ferrets, because we talked a little bit more about rats and mice than we did some of the other animals. So again, as I said, gestation length, since rats and mice are used a lot for research and also because they can breed very fast, know that their gestation length is 21 to 23 days. So it's very, very short compared to the other species that we've talked about. So do know how long that is. Hamsters can be kept as pets. Guinea pigs. Guinea pigs are a good model for human diseases. That's kind of an important thing. And then birds can also be kept as companion animals. Monkeys can be kept as companion animals like we discussed. But, know that it is illegal to own monkeys in some states, and that a big issue with owning a monkey is that they can carry zoonotic diseases. So you have to be really careful. And then we also talked about reptiles and amphibians. So again, you're not going to need to know how many turtles are in the U.S. Just kind of know, what animals fall under that category and that they are kept as companion animals. Okay. So that is all I have for the review. I didn't want to take up too much time, so I just wanted to kind of go through all of those and briefly point out what I thought was important. Hopefully, you feel like you have a good understanding of the things that I'm going to ask you about and the things that you kind of need to pay attention to for the exam. Again, please let me know if you have any questions, if you have any specific questions about your proctor or anything like that. You can email me for any general questions about the material and the exam. Feel free to post it in that discussion board forum. And I wish you all good luck. Have fun studying. I hope that you are really interested in the material and that you learn a lot while you're studying, and be prepared for the test on Thursday. Have a good day.